Look at what they took from us. Look at it. Examine, if you will, the cowardice at play. The developers at the House of Monster Hunter stealing from you, from all of us, the once provocatively deliberate camera angle and crawl animation of our hunters scampering through a narrow cave path or overhang. It is, in a word, outrageous. It is un-Monster Hunter-like, and if one's IQ was low enough to make the Antarctic summer seem toasty, one might even blame it on wokiness. I mean, what's wrong with awkwardly staring at the wriggling splay of bums and thighs in this game about monster hunting? Don't we deserve a little respite from the stresses of the hunt? Aren't we owed a little titillation to balance out all of the violence? Why have the Monster Hunter devs stolen from us these fleeting moments of bum-based joy? I mean, really? Who the heck crawls through a tube sideways, scraping your hip along the ground? It's ridiculous. It's appalling to have a basic tradition of Monster Hunter be nerfed like this for no reason. And I, for one, will not stand for it. Boycott this game. Don't buy it until the devs backtrack on this ridiculous decision. Hello again, I am Blunty, and that was, for the record, sarcasm, of course. A wee touch of derisive banter, mild mockery, a gentle jibe, if you will. I mean, don't get me wrong, I was, very honestly, truly shocked to see this weird and frankly unnecessary change to the animations of our hunters when you do crawl through a little tight space like that, and confused by it, because let's face it, Capcom do seem to enjoy allowing a fair share of titillation in the game. They've never shied away from it, everything from just frankly unnecessarily hot NPCs all the way down to the traditionally silly and practically skimpy battle armor and the intrinsically Monster Hunter-y thigh windows in said armor. Why suddenly do they get so shy about an upskirt shot of our own hunters? It's weird, right? But as a framing device for this video to then talk about what the controversy will be in Wilds, it's a fun setup. What singular mechanic will the player community land on to be the dividing line, the figurative battlefield between those who like pineapple on their pizza versus people with functioning taste receptors and personal dignity? Because there's always at least one in every game, isn't there? In every generation, in every title, in every expansion, there's that one thing that we all argue about, isn't there? So I wonder what will be the big one for Wilds. I have a couple of ideas about that. Maybe it'll be about how they're changing how food and food buffs work. Maybe it'll be something to do with the massive changes to multiplayer's underpinning mechanics necessitated by the new, more fluid open field systems and playstyles. I think most likely, though, it'll be about the new wound mechanic and associated targeting systems. I've already seen some rumbling about it out of the beta, alongside claims that it dumbs things down too much, makes things too easy, or some other such change-induced fear reaction. And on first blush, I actually really like the new system. It's a near-perfect blending, in my opinion, of what they tried to do with the tenderizing systems in Iceborne, paired with the curio-afflicted weak part targeting and burst damage from Sunbreak. Instead of having to break combat flow to cause a weak spot, a la the Clutch Claw, you're naturally just creating wounds by attacking the same body part repeatedly. Which makes absolute sense for creating a wound, something you'll be naturally doing anyway in the standard flow of battle, so you'd have to change your playstyle just to do it. Then you can burst the wound with a special attack for a big pop of damage all at once, or you can just continue to fight like you have been and engage with the normal flow of combat and just treat it as a weakened spot for extra standard damage, which then, after you've done enough damage, bursts on its own. It's far more natural, more inherent, more immersive, and absolutely more fluid than either Iceborne's Clutch Claw tenderizing stuff or Sunbreak's self-generating curio blobs. I think it's a super clever system, but I bet it will cause arguments for an age to come, especially in multiplayer, where certain weapons will want to monopolize early bursting of the wounds for special move buffs. Looking at you, bow users. Yeah, I can absolutely see this being a hot button topic for a long time to come, much like how the clutch claw mechanic from Iceborne still, to this very day, has people talking and arguing about how it affected gameplay. But for context, and as a little reminder of, a few other things people freaked out about when it arrived as a change to the previously established mechanics of Monster Hunter, and now many of them go utterly without embittered comment or even without notice, for the most part just accepted as part of the game, taken for granted even. When World first launched, players were very angry about how, for the first time ever, you could keep moving while consuming a potion, or indeed any other consumable buff and healing item. See, before World, if you didn't know, consuming an item like a potion would cement you on the spot for quite a long eating and then flexing animation. It was very high risk just to heal. And being able to walk while drinking a potion, and even more shockingly, being able to cancel out of the action of full consumption, or even cancel out of the weapon sharpening animation, was heavily derided by old schoolers as making the game too easy and nerfing the risk-reward of it all. Of course, what people forgot in this argument for the large part was in older games, the zones were separate spaces you'd load into separately, so changing a zone meant complete escape from the aggro of the monster, and people could use that to get a safe space to heal or sharpen in perfect peace. So walking while healing was a mechanical change made to the game because, well, World didn't have those loading zones. It was a one single fluid map the monster could follow you around in. And that open field map design was, by the way, something people loved about World. I also remember people whining loudly about having to grind investigations for decorations in World, only to have just as many people whine just as loudly when investigations and track gathering was absent entirely from the next game. World took itself a little more seriously than previous games, more grounded, more gritty, and with that came a lack of the wackier weapon designs and armors, and the lack of visual creativity and diversity and variety in the weapons was heavily criticized in World, and I agree with that one to some extent. I love me some goofy weapons and armor, and I do think Monster Hunter is at its very best when it refuses to take itself too seriously. Oh, and here's a personal one. I hate the scout flies in World. They're way too visually obnoxious. They get in the way. On certain maps, they're near useless for the one and only intended purpose of a navigational aid. Burn for your crimes against navigational ease, ancient forest. Burn for your crimes, your very sins against getting someplace. I will argue at length about how much frustration the scout flies caused me personally in World. And don't even get me started on the floods of entirely undeserved hatred for the handler. It's bewildering to me. I'm not even kidding. I mean, sure, she has astonishingly poor impulse control that keeps repeatedly getting her in trouble. As a damsel in distress, which is, not a great trope. It's a miracle she lived to see adulthood, but I really do like her as a character. She's fun. She's joyful. Doesn't quite make up for the lack of a giant frozen fish for a weapon as far as goofiness goes in the game, but, And of course, the cherry on the top of World's controversies was the clutch claw, which I'm guessing few, if any, people watching this will need full context for that argument. We've all heard it enough, haven't we? And then Rise came along, and there were so many arguments about the Rampage quests and their mechanics. Personally, I liked them. I wasn't sad to see them left out of the expansion when Sunbreak arrived. I didn't love them that much. I never did understand the absolute loathing some people had for them. If you engaged with the systems properly, it was a pretty fun gimmick in my opinion. Then there was the Spirit Bird stuff in Rise. Again, for some reason, people hated on them so aggressively. I never found it much of an issue. Basically, every single map had a pretty optimal path from camp to the various monster zones that you had plenty of spirit birds to easily collect, just as a matter of course of getting there if you needed them for the buffs. It took like 45 seconds. I still remember seeing people going, I don't want to spend 5 minutes collecting spirit birds before I go fight the monster. 5 minutes? What are you talking about? It's just 45 seconds, a minute max, and you're already using that time to get to the monster in the first place. What are you talking about? And even then, once you build a halfway decent armor set, or indeed just got good enough at the game, you could forget the spirit birds existed entirely and not bother collecting them deliberately. I certainly don't anymore. Or, once more baffling to me, people complaining about not having to micromanage environmental stuff with the lack of hot and cold drinks. A mechanic I always found tedious at best. It didn't make the game more challenging to have that system in there. It didn't feel more immersive to keep chugging some magical fireproofing lemonade every 5 minutes while fighting inside a volcano with magical, paralyzing weapons and big dinosaurs and stuff. My immersion, the realism of the game wasn't enhanced by a magical fireproofing lemonade that let me survive standing on literal magma. It was just a fiddly mechanic that was annoying for no good reason. I was glad to see it gone. Although apparently in Wilds we're getting it back in some form. There'll be some food buffs that we'll need to manage. Not necessarily drinks anymore, but we'll have to make a special meal to fireproof us or something perhaps. Still waiting on seeing the full details of that. Oh, and Rise, in the eyes of some people, ruined invading monsters by turning them from a, desperately dangerous problem to have into a burst of free damage with the new mounting and puppeteering mechanics, the wirebug riding thing. And that one I kind of softly agree with. The arrival of an invading basil goose, for example, in World was a bum-puckering moment. And in Risebreak, the exact same situation, the arrival of a basil, it was met with a giddy grin. Hooray, here comes a ton of damage I can do. And yes, it did ruin invaders in that sense. They didn't feel like a threat anymore rather than a gift. But it was also replaced by a fun mechanic anyway that you could use to your advantage. So, 6 one, half dozen the other. Don't think it made the game worse or better, just made it different. And of course in Rise, even more compounded with Sunbreak's additions to the system, significant additions to the system, the wirebugs. Much maligned by some, a few, perhaps, once more, for making the game too easy, quote unquote, by letting you escape a monster's attack too easily by zerping out of the way, Spider-Man style, or making the hunter too fast, too mobile, too powerful. But again, all of that was balanced. Monsters were faster too, more mobile, and by the time you got to late in endgame, especially Sunbreak's endgame, you'd be heavily punished by using the wirebugs to try and escape certain attacks, or indeed counter at the wrong time instead of using some other evasion technique. The harder monsters were designed specifically to punish brainless use of the wirebug mechanics. Point is, I hope it's clear by now, there's always arguments about any and every new major mechanic and even some minor ones. Sometimes it's just about people having hostile aversions to change, any change, and I get that. Some people are just like that. It's part of how their brains are wired up. Sometimes it's very valid concerns about how something changes the traditional nature of the game, or at least the imagined traditions of this ever-evolving series that changes its quote-unquote traditions every iteration. And I do earnestly wonder what those topics will be for Wilds. The wound and targeting mechanics is an obvious one, because we've been hands-on with it already in the form of the beta, and again in a week and a half now in the second beta. But I wonder what else we'll be drawing lines in the sand about. What don't we know yet that they've changed that's going to meaningfully alter how we engage with the game, in good or bad ways, and how are we going to argue about it? How split down the middle is the community going to be about certain things? Several weapons, for example, have big changes. Maybe even as big as the hugely controversial reworking of the hunting horn in Rise, which infuriated and frustrated a lot of long-term hunting horn players, but I found super duper fun. But after Rise and Sunbreak, when I went back to World, I tried the hunting horn there in that game for the first time, and I found it fun there too. But it is a very different weapon between those two games. And in Wilds, it's changing slightly again. It's not quite like Wild, it's certainly not like Rise, but I had a lot of fun with it in the beta. The ranged weapons are getting heavy reworks too. Lance feels like an entirely new animal. I had fun using the Lance for literally the first time ever, and while Switch Axe felt pretty good in the beta to me, apparently there's still more changes happening to it by release. It's all part of the fun of a new Monster Hunter game. The only trick to it is not getting your panties entirely knotted up. Speaking of panties, I recorded this footage in the first beta. As you can see, I had to crawl back and forth a few times to make sure I wasn't hallucinating. It really was a super odd choice. I was shocked by it. I was like, what do they do to the crawling animation? What the hell, man? Why? I still remember the very first time I got an awkward upskirt on my first Hunter's manhams in World, and then again and again and again revisited that animation every single time we visit the special arena, and especially when you're crawling behind another Hunter who may have even more skimpier armor on you, staring right up there at Jaxie. It's all weird and embarrassing, and it made me feel strange things. And I kept waiting for someone else to notice this, to talk about this change in Wilds, but as far as I've seen so far, no one else seems to care. It can't be just me, right? It must not be just me. Please don't let it be just me. I mean, so, you know, I always felt mildly embarrassed by staring at the Jaxie of my hunter or someone else's hunter, but still, it's just traditional. It's the fiddling with traditions. Bring back the splayed crawling. Hashtag bring back the Jaxie. Bumholes for all. Thank you for watching. I'm Blondie. I'll catch you next time. Thank you as always to the patrons scrolling away up above there.